what we're going to do is focus on the passive voice. When you're using the passive voice, you need to think the noun that you're using, the passive voice is changing the verb form. So we need to think about the noun. Is it plural or singular? Now remember, this comes back to what we talked about before. And then it will become is or are, depending on the noun. For example, these bricks, because it's plural, we're going to use are and then the ed. This mixture, again, this is a bit of a tricky one actually, but this mixture, which is actually uncountable, we're now going to use is turned into. But finally, notice this example here. This is where we have a very complicated phrase. The clay used to make the bricks is dug up. So now it's not the bricks that's the main noun. The main noun is clay. So this is an example of a very complex noun phrase which then needs to be connected to an accurate passive voice, and that is a wee bit tricky. But if you can do that well, again, that example there would be very high level, and 8 level candidate or 9 would be looking for that kind of grammar. Just explaining it there. Now, so what do you need to do? In terms of using the passive voice, learn as many past participle forms as you can. Often it's just ed. In regular verbs, it's just ed. So it's past participle forms for irregular verbs. For example, swim, swam, swum. Okay, so you need to know the third verb form. Often the diagram will show you some key verbs, but usually they won't be in the past participle form. They won't usually be in that third form, so you have been asked to change that. Yes, if they're regular or irregular. If it's regular, it's easy. You just add the ed. Yep, learn as many as you can, especially, and note if they're irregular. And here are some examples of some irregular verbs: grind and ground, dig, dug, dug, cut, 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 you know. So for example, if we were talking about cooking, the onions were cut. Okay. Now, if you don't know the past participle, if it's an irregular verb, for example, or a verb you're not familiar with, which may happen in the process, don't use it. Use the one they have there and change to the active voice. You remember, sometimes it's okay to use the active voice in a process because active voices are, using the active voice will show variety as well instead of continually using the passive. So let's now focus on the passive in a process. Now, we did mention before not to overuse the passive. The difference is in a process, sometimes in a diagram. Process, definitely, we want to use the passive. We should be using it a lot. We're interested in the action and not who is doing the action. So we've given you one example there. How many more can you find? And yes, there are lots. Now, when we show you the noun, yes, notice the noun before, and that shows you the form. So we've got the clay used to make, as we said before, is. Why not are? We mentioned it before, because clay is the main noun form. Now, although water is uncountable, we're just going to explain why this is are here. That may have been confusing before. We can say water is added, but because we're talking about sand and water, we have two things. So we need to now say are. Sand and water are added. And notice the final one there, the bricks are packed and delivered to their destinations. Now, this is what we call parallel structure, where the person uses the same verb twice. And you only need to use the verb to be once. So they are packed and delivered. That's high level grammar as well, being able to use parallel structure. Now, here's a chance for you to focus on an activity yourself. So just have a go describing the simple process of making mashed potatoes, which is one of my favorite things. Little clue for you: use plurals. We see it's potatoes, and you can use all of these verbs and nouns. So some of these are in a verb form or a gerund form, and some with the er are describing nouns, but you can use them to make passive sentences. So don't forget, sometimes you can try changing to the active voice. Just one little other thing there. If you want to, you can describe that to your partner verbally first, rather than writing it, just to get used to using the passive voice, and then try writing. Now, let's move on to a diagram and think now of this example here of what is missing. The tip there is very helpful. It's just a very small word. You will probably notice it immediately, but how many are missing? You will be surprised how many. "24, can you believe it? Yes, 24 times. Now that's 24 words. If the examiner has to count, and sometimes in a diagram you might not have enough words, very easy to get your word count up. So it's a nice simple way to improve your word count, which is going to help with your task achievement as well as being accurate here. So we see there's a lot of articles in there. Every noun that we see in a diagram must have an article. Now don't forget that articles are also important in a process too. So articles are similar in diagrams and processes. So we need to have a little focus activity here, because a lot of candidates are confused. I get lots of questions about how to use articles. And the truth is, they're very complicated in English. There's lots of exceptions. But some of the key rules relating to task 1 writing are these things. There are far more rules than I'm going to show you now, but here's some basic rules. Use a or an in a diagram the first time the object is mentioned. And then, in subsequent times, refer to the object as the. For plural nouns, though, we're going to use the. Okay, so we don't say a changing rooms. We say the changing rooms. So that's a wee bit tricky there as well. And also at the start of linking phrases. So hopefully you've thought about that before. So the current design, or in the future plan. If you go back and have a look at that last page, you'll see how often they've been used as well. I would like you to have a go practicing. So here is a golf club, and the change in a golf club over time, a century apart. So what words would you use there? Now, another thing we should focus on in this diagram is the change into the future. So the grammar and the language we use, which are closely connected here, the lexical resource and grammar are often very similar and they work together. So we need to have a look at how this person talks about the future and how they describe the future change. So right now I'd like you to stop and have a look yourself for the language used to describe future change. And here we see it coming up now. So, and we'll go paragraph by paragraph. So in the first paragraph, we've seen this, these two examples here, which are basically exactly the same. But notice they've used the adverb after the first one significantly. So it's will plus be plus past verb. In the middle paragraph, there's nothing because they're talking about the current or present design. So there's nothing about the future. But in the third paragraph, it's being used again. So we see will be replaced by. So this is the passive form. So it's future passive, as the same as the introduction grammar. But then the next sentence is just using will future, which will allow. Okay, so that's a good example of variety there. So the candidate's using variety of future grammar to get a higher tense. And then this sentence is actually very complicated because it continues at the last part there, which will allow the weights in aerobics room to be lengthened. Right there is an example of very high level verb, a very high level verb phrase. The swimming area will be completely changed, so that's similar again to the grammar we've been using, the future passive. Now the next one is going to be changed. So that's a good chunk to use as well. It has exactly the same meaning as will be changed into, but just changing will to is going to, and you can switch them around. So you could have gone up to the pool area is going to be changed significantly in the introduction as well. And finally, they've used the passive voice there because some is planned. Sometimes we can use that if it's a plan that is written and we know about. We can use the passive voice, the present passive, to talk about the future if we use certain words. For example, planned. So is planned. Okay, or is expected would be another one. Not accurate for this diagram, but that you could use that. So there's certain words in English that we can use. So the person has used a variety of future tenses here, which is what you need to get a high level mark. So we'll go back to the golf club that you saw before and you focused on with articles. So write a paragraph for the golf club in 2001 and send it to your partner and check how did they do with this one. I'll give you a little clue. Here's some words you could use there. These are sentences you could use. Okay, so you should be able to guess those answers from one example leading into the other. So those two sentences, can you try and put it together in a paragraph? Only talk about 2001, but if you'd like to talk about the change to the 100 years previously. Today was a grammar review. So don't forget to check. That's important. We need to check at the end of our writing. These are the things we've looked at today. We looked at inaccurate tenses in a line graph. Remember the red problems that we looked at. Subject-verb agreement, plural nouns, and how plural nouns might compound into other errors in a bar chart. Then we looked at a pie chart. For a start, we looked at lack of punctuation. And then we considered how sentences could be combined together and how you need to use punctuation for that as well. We looked at a table in terms of overusing the passive. Now the passive, as I mentioned, is sometimes overused in tables, pie charts, line graphs, and bar charts by candidates. It should be used in processes and diagrams, but not so much in the data, the number pictures. We also looked at creating noun phrases and subordinate clauses with tables, and then we looked at the process and the importance of using the passive voice, and now when you should use the passive voice, and also how to use it with plural nouns. And we need to think about missing articles. Remember, that's also important in a process, and the language to describe change, present and future, but also think about other types of change as well. So thank you. If you want extra work, go back and look at those things in terms of the other examples we looked at. So if you like to focus on punctuation, for example, look in the process, look in the diagram, look in the line graph. Okay. Remember, passive voice should only really be in the process and the diagram, so only look for it really there. But the noun phrases and the subordinate clauses, the combining sentences, you can look at all 6.